In this video, we are going to start our discussion of Chapter 34, which covers the Federal Reserve, also known simply as the Fed. In this video, we are just going to introduce the idea of the Federal Reserve, talk a little bit about what it does, and very briefly talk about parts of its structure. All right, so first, we're going to talk about what the Fed actually does. All right, so what does the Fed do? It's got several kind of things that it's under its purview. The first one that we're going to talk about is banking. Right. So the Federal Reserve is sometimes referred to as the bank of banks, and the reason for that is because the Federal Reserve maintains accounts for other banks and financial institutions. We're going to talk a little bit more about those accounts later on. It also maintains the account for the U.S. Treasury. So all of the kind of banking done by the U.S. government is essentially done through the Federal Reserve. It also does some kind of traditional banking stuff. Right? Well, those were traditional banking things, right? Holding accounts, right, or maintaining accounts might be better. It also lends money. So we're going to talk about this later on. Sometimes the Federal Reserve is known as the lender of last resort. Again, we'll talk about that later, but it does lend money to other banks, right? So if a bank needs to borrow money, they're probably going to turn to the Federal Reserve if they don't have any other options. All right. Right, another thing that the Fed does is borrowing. Right? So whenever the U.S. Treasury or the U.S. government borrows money, the Federal Reserve is the one that manages that borrowing. Right, that one's pretty short. That's really all we got for that one. The rest of these are going to be shorter. Right. Right, it's also involved in regulation. So the Federal Reserve has regulatory power over banks in the U.S. Some of these things we're going to talk about them. Right, some of these types of regulations that they are going to enforce, and later on in a separate video. All right, and then last but certainly not least, the Federal Reserve is in charge of creating money. So again, this is just the introduction of this topic, and we're going to talk more about this for sure. That is one of the big functions and one of the ones that we are going to focus on for most of this chapter, or at least a lot of this chapter. Right. So the Federal Reserve is the body that's tasked with creating this money and also with getting it out into the economy as a whole. Again, we're going to talk about those things as we move forward. But those are the things that the Fed does. All right. Then just very briefly, we're going to talk about the way the Fed is organized. I'm not super concerned about you guys knowing how the Fed is organized because it doesn't necessarily help you understand what we're building to, which is monetary policy. But the Federal Reserve is made up of kind of 12 regional banks, right? So there are 12 regions in the U.S. Each one has its own kind of Federal Reserve, its own kind of director, and then the overarching Federal Reserve at the very top, so kind of out of those 12, you have the 12, and then you also have the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who kind of directs the federal level. All right. Currently, the chairman of the Fed is Jerome Powell, as of July 2020. Right. So if you're watching this in the future, it might not be the chair of the Fed anymore, but so also, I guess, since I mentioned that, chairman of the Fed does have a term limit. All right. But again, not too concerned about you guys knowing the intricate details on how it's structured. If you are interested in that, then your textbook does go into it more. And you could also just Google it. I'm sure Wikipedia has a very in-depth article or page for the structure of the Federal Reserve. All right, but that was just a kind of brief introduction, what the Fed does, a little bit about how it's structured. In the next in the next video, what we're going to start talking about is this right here, right? So creating money, right? We're really just talking about the money supply, right? So talking about what is money, what types of money are there, so on and so forth. All right, but that will be in the next video, and I will see you then.